Hi, my name is Prakhar. I am a student of English literature. And you know what is the one thing I really hate? I hate it when people say that literature is not good enough of a subject to pursue a degree in. But that's not true. They deem it to be something very simple that everybody can do it. But it's not true. Literature has its own complexities, its own complex topics. And in this lesson, we're going to talk about one of the complex genres of poetry. Let's start with it. Lesson 10 in the course, Genres of Poetry, is about metaphysical poetry. Let us start by understanding the definition of metaphysical poetry. Metaphysical poetry is a form of intellectual poetry that is written to express highly complicated thought revolving around abstract subject matter. It relies on devices like imagery and conceits to convey the message. So in simpler words, metaphysical poetry is the poetry of abstract, and it requires a highly intellectual style to be done justice to, because that is how complicated the subject matter of this sort of poetry is. Metaphysical poetry originated in the 17th century, and the poets who are associated with this kind of poetry are John Donne, George Herbert, Richard Crashaw, and all of them wrote poems having similar characteristics. Now, when they were writing these poems, metaphysical poetry was not a known genre. Later, when these poems were studied and it was found out that they had similar characters, and then the poems with such characteristics were called to be metaphysical poetry. The term metaphysical was coined by critic Samuel Johnson in his book Lives of the Most Eminent English Poets. This book is considered to be Johnson's greatest work, and the literal translation of the word metaphysical is after physical. So you can understand what sort of subject matter and theme is in the poems that are called metaphysical poems, because they talk about bigger questions. They talk about things like the perception of reality by humans. They talk about things like what happens after death. All the poems that fall under the category of metaphysical poetry follow certain conventions. First is that metaphysics is about the nature of reality. Metaphysics is a branch of philosophy that deals with the first principles of things, including abstract concepts such as being, knowing, identity, time, and space. Second convention is that metaphysical poetry covers topics ranging from religion to human understanding, everything in between, to the way how humans perceive things, to the way how the things should be perceived, what religion means, what we can draw from religion. It's a very, very broad range of topics. And the third convention is that it tries to suffice consciousness into words and make sense of it. How do we define consciousness? Consciousness is the state of being aware of and responsive to one's surrounding. Consciousness in itself is a pretty interesting and a confusing topic, because it's difficult to understand where does it start from. It is pretty subjective. Why have we given the power of consciousness? And metaphysical poetry in itself, being a very confusing kind of poetry, now talks about consciousness and tries to suffice it into words, and this is where it gets its complicated nature from. Having established metaphysical poetry and its conventions, let us talk about the characteristics of metaphysical poetry. The defining characteristic of metaphysical poetry is metaphysical conceit, which is drawing a parallel between two very different unrelated things. It can be confused with metaphors in which there's a wordplay between the literal meaning and the implied meaning of the use of the words. But in metaphysical conceit, there's a drawing of parallel between two very unrelated things. If you read examples of metaphysical conceits, you'll wonder that it's sort of an art, because you could not have thought that these things could be related in this manner. For example, in the poem A Valediction, Forbidden Mourning by John Donne, what John Donne does is he compares the continuing relationship during the physical parting his beloved with the 2 feet of a draftsman compass. So here he draws a parallel between how the 2 feet are working and going in different directions, but they are connected at the base. Similarly, he may be physically parting with his beloved, but they still are one. They are connected through a connection of soul. Another example is these lines from Saint Mary Magdalene by Richard Crashaw. Two faithful fountains, two walking baths, two weeping motions, portable and compendious oceans. These beautiful lines have been written to signify tears, have been written to signify the action of crying. And I could not have thought that they could be put down into words so beautifully. The second characteristic about metaphysical poetry is its subject matter. Usually, the subject matter revolves around abstract themes and it raises serious questions about existence, and the subject matter revolves around thoughts and feelings. The name itself means that the poetry is about the things that are after physical. So the subject matter that is taken up by poets when they are writing metaphysical poetry is definitely that is not found in physical forms. That can be only felt, and they try to express it using metaphysical poetry. Let us take example of the poem Death Be Not Proud by John Donne. This poem, John Donne is directly talking to death, and here we can see a bit of personification of death. In personification, it can be called the use of apostrophe, because here Donne is addressing to something that is not alive. You can directly see it in the lines that I have highlighted. One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. These lines, it is very evident that the subject matter of this poem is about what happens after we die, is about what happens to the soul after it leaves the body. So naturally it falls under metaphysical poetry, and naturally it gets a bit complicated here because these are abstract things which are in their own way difficult to perceive and understand, and even more difficult to write about and explain. Another example is the poem Peace by George Herbert, in which Herbert has written about peace and he is directly talking to peace. It is evident in the first line, sweet peace, where dost thou dwell? He is asking, where can I find peace? And the whole poem is about the speaker's struggle to find peace and to look for it in places, but he fails because wherever he looks for it, it tells him that he is supposed to find peace somewhere else. The next characteristic is the devices that are used other than conceit. Conceit is the main defining device that is used, but apart from that, the poets also rely on wit, puns, and paradoxes, and it can be said that the serious themes are sometimes dealt with humor. It can be said that it's the talent of the poets because they beautifully mix the seriousness of the theme and the humor created by these devices in such a manner that the seriousness of the theme is not lost and the comical effect is created. Out of all the poets who wrote metaphysical poetry, Donne is the one who is very popular for his wit. And these are a few examples of the things he has written which show that he was a very witty poet. First is, if things of sight such as heaven be, what heavens are those we cannot see? And then there are these other lines, I wonder, by my troth what thou and I did till we loved. Wit is the natural aptitude for using words and ideas in a quick and inventive way to create humor, and we can see this in these lines. Here are the popular examples of metaphysical poetry. If you want to refer to any of these, there are several other poems which fall into the category of metaphysical poetry. You can always refer to other poems as well, but the most popular ones are The Flea, The Valediction, and The Canonization by John Donne, and then To His Coy Mistress and The Garden by Andrew Marvell, and Peace and Easter Wings by George Herbert. On your screen you have the text of this very small and beautiful sonnet, Death Be Not Proud by John Donne. In this poem, as I mentioned, Donne is talking to death, and Donne tries to deal with the question, Donne tries to explain what happens after a person dies. And though it is a sonnet, it is written in the form of a sonnet, it is also an example of metaphysical poetry because of the subject matter and because of how it has been written. You can always pause and go through these lines and you will understand the several characteristics of metaphysical poetry we have just discussed. And that is it. With this, we are done with metaphysical poetry. And what are we going to do next? In the next lesson, we are going to talk about sonnets. And there you go, metaphysical done. I hope this helped. Thank you for taking this course. We are left with 2 more lessons, which is sonnet and then finally a quiz in this course. I hope I really helped you with the understanding of metaphysical poetry.